Hello, hello, hello. It is May 31st, and I'm redoing the blog I did this morning simply because I felt like I didn't explain the David Platt stuff well enough. So if you were here this morning, I talked a little bit about this book, Radical by David Platt, and I think it was chapter 7. Yeah, chapter 7. I was arguing that he is making a false dilemma. Now, a false dilemma is a logical fallacy. And a logical fallacy is something that seems like it proves a point, but actually doesn't. And a false dilemma is a type of fallacy where it's like if you ask someone, a question and you give them a limited set of options. It's like if I asked, have you stopped beating your wife? Come on, yes or no, answer the question. But I rule out the options where we're never married or never beat her. So the question would be, what is David Platt's false dilemma? Well, David Platt's false dilemma revolves around the thing Christians believe called the gospel and how that plays out in the world and that kind of thing. The gospel is basically the core belief of Christians, if you want to know what Christians believe and what that's all about. Basically, there's a God that's good and perfect, and there's humans who are bad and sinful and in need of being made right with God. And this can only be done by Jesus Christ, who died to bear the punishment that humans deserve. And if you believe in Him, then that will apply to you. So that's the gospel, and the question becomes, for David Platt, is revolving around this: if you believe in Him. He says, what about people who never hear about Jesus? Logically, how could they believe if they've never heard about something? So how do they fit into this scenario? And David Platt sets up a false dilemma. He gives you two options. He says, either people who've never heard about Jesus go to heaven, or they go to hell. Okay? Now, that may sound like a perfectly legitimate dilemma and not a false dilemma. You may think, well, what other option is there? But before we move on to any third option, let's just look at it. He's saying either they go to heaven or they go to hell. Now, the question becomes, well, which one does Dr. Platt, want you to choose? Well, obviously, he wants you to choose that they go to hell. He literally wants you to choose that people who have never heard about Jesus go to hell because they didn't believe in Jesus. And that's his stance. He argues against the idea that they get a free pass into heaven without having to believe in Jesus, because he says if that's the case, then you should never tell people about Jesus, because then they would go to heaven. Then they would maybe not go to heaven, but if they, just as long as they didn't hear about it, they would definitely go to heaven. And so and the Bible teaches that you're supposed to tell people about Jesus, and it's good news and important to spread it. So that's where he's coming from with all that. Now, the problem is that the idea that they just go to hell is a little bit weird too, because Jesus came to earth and died, and then it's kind of weird that he just not real important to him if people hear about it. He went to a lot of trouble for something that, and he's like, who cares if they know? They need to know for it to have any effect on their lives. I'm all right with it. It doesn't seem like it makes sense at all. And really, the way Platt's got it set up, it's kind of like pick your poison, and he's just saying my poison is less poisonous, or at least more biblical. It's not really. But anyway, it's a false dilemma. There's a third option. And the third option is this: perhaps people who are willing to admit that they are sinners in need of being made right with God always hear the gospel. This doesn't mean everyone will hear the gospel. It just means the people who are willing to admit they're sinners hear the gospel. And it's interesting that Dr. Platt admitted it earlier on in the chapter, that the book of Romans earlier says, everyone knows they're a sinner in need of God. So there's no point in telling someone that Jesus died for your sins if you don't want to admit that you're a sinner, and that you're going to hell, and that you've got a problem and you're separated from God. So, if you believe in a sovereign God who knows everything and is in control of everything and can have a super plan for all events, then it's not that hard of a jump to believe that he'll see to it somehow that the people who are willing to admit they need God and willing to call out to God will always somehow, somebody, somewhere will tell those people about Jesus, because people randomly, here and there hear about Jesus. But there you go. I mean, there's not much more to say. Now, the thing is, David Platt's a Calvinist, so Calvinists believe that God doesn't care about everyone going to heaven, because they believe God just makes people go to heaven. And so I could see why David Platt believes that God doesn't really care if they hear about him and they just go to hell, and it's fair because they're sinners. I mean, the fairness of it is irrelevant for any of you who are Calvinists. That's irrelevant. Of course it's fair for everyone to go to hell, but if Jesus was all about being fair, he wouldn't have died on the cross. So anyway, if you're confused, if you're concerned, is David Platt a Calvinist? I'll put a link in the description, and you can go. It's to a blog post that's his church's website, and then there's a video of a sermon you have to watch. But you can watch a sermon, and he makes it pretty clear that he's a Calvinist. But anyway, I thought we'd talk about some other stuff. There's one interesting topic that, for those of you who are Christians and read your Bibles, there's an interesting topic for you to study. Greek life and Greek culture. The Bible was written in Greek, mostly to Greek people, and if you want to know the context of your New Testament, look up Greek morality and what it was like, and think about the things you know about the Greek gods that they worshipped, and that's what the Greeks believed was sacred and holy, the things like Zeus and Aphrodite and Athena and these kinds of things. But I think that's something that Christians might need to understand a little more about, because really what happened to all that Greek mythology and that way of life was Christianity. So the Bible was basically like a bomb dropped in that whole thought system. And that may be a pretty interesting story. So I'm not even going to tell you, other than to say that in Athens, you're a 13-year-old boy. You were expected to go mingle with 50-year-old men, and if you were lucky, one of them would come and take you into the woods for 2 years and have sex with you and teach you the ways of manhood. And that was, you were made fun of and looked down on if you didn't get that as a 13-year-old boy. And they had a god of ecstasy and wine and drugs. To worship that god, you had to do that. It was your sacred right to worship Aphrodite by having sex with Aphrodite's temple prostitutes. It was not your sacred right, it was your sacred duty. It was your sacred duty to Zeus to cheat on your wife sometimes. So, I mean, Christian morality changed things. Morality was not always the way it is today. And another topic. Is there a Christian candidate for president? My dad and I were talking about this on Memorial Day. He was just like, Obama says he's a Christian, and I was like, yeah, Obama claims to be, a Christian more strongly than pretty much anyone in the last 50, 60 years for president, other than George W. Bush. George W. Bush and Obama are the two most overtly Christian candidates. Now you could argue that Obama's a faker. You could argue that George W.'s a faker. Who knows, right? But presidents like Reagan clearly said, I'm not that into religion, but when there was a lot of voting power, he allied himself with religious people, and that's really where the idea of Republicans being Christians came in. This whole idea of I'm a Republican, I'm a Christian, because Republicans supported political issues that Christians wanted in the 80s, and it got Reagan elected not just by a little bit, but by a lot. So he had a lot of power to put a lot of things into action, and that was a big deal, and that's how Republicans got known as a Christian party. But the thing about Obama is he does support a lot of issues that he's pro-abortion, he's pro-gay marriage, and a lot of Christians are against that. And then the interesting thing on the flip side is Mitt Romney is the Republican candidate, and if you don't know, he's a Mormon, and Mormons are not Christian. Mormons believe, I mean, this is what the missionaries have told me, that the universe is filled with countless gods who achieve their godhood through obedience to eternal laws, and the God of our planet, you know, was born to a god and goddess and lived his life on another planet like Earth and achieved godhood through obedience to eternal laws, and you can too. He'll always be beyond you because basically he's got a head start on you. And I think anyone who knows much about Christianity is pretty clear that like the belief in the one true and perfect God is like pretty fundamental to what Christians believe. And a final thing to talk about. I was talking with a kid at church the other day, young boy named Brandon, and I was just joking around about how pro athletes and college athletes, you know, pretty much all use steroids and use all the other drugs too. I was joking around about how people say things about steroids, but really they use other drugs too. Anyway, he looked at me and he said, "Well, Tim Tebow says he doesn't use steroids," and I looked at him and I said, "Do you believe that?" And he looked at me and he was just like, whoa. It was just like an epiphany for him, because he'd never thought like, what if Tebow is just totally lying? It was like, so let's look through the logic of whether or not someone uses steroids in pro sports. If someone uses steroids, do you think that person will have an advantage over the people who do not? Yes. Therefore, you would expect the person who does not use steroids to struggle, be one of the not as good players maybe. Especially in these like track races where everyone's like a millisecond different. But let's just look at some information about Tim Tebow to see where he measures up. Alright. This is in the 2009 draft. These were things that were being said about him. I'm looking at Wikipedia here. It says, according to former Tampa Bay Buccaneers coach John Gruden, he's talking about Tebow here. Tebow, could revolutionize the pro game, says Gruden. Tebow is 250 pounds, and he's the strongest human being that's ever played the position. He can throw well enough at any level. Former Indianapolis Colts coach Tony Dungy said he would pick Tebow with a top 10 pick and would take him over any quarterback in the 2010 draft. Oh, it's 2010 draft. Alright. On the other hand, NFL analyst Mel Kiper believed that Tebow did not have the intangibles to play quarterback in the NFL. I don't think he can be a full-time quarterback. I don't think he can be the quarterback of the future for you, but I do think in the third round, maybe in the second round, he'll be the same as Pat White, said Kiper. But anyway, there you go. I got nothing left to say. I hope you'll have a wonderful evening.